Well, Paul, thanks so much for joining us. Paul Dawson is a writer on climate solutions based in Glasgow. His newsletter and book club, Climate Solutions, provides subscribers up-to-date information on climate. It's great that you could join us on SCOTONOMICS, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, William and Corinne. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. So we want to know why climate solutions? How did that come about?
Well, I've had an interesting climate change for probably over 20 years. I mean, it started initially that actually I became quite fascinated by the CO2 numbers going up every year, and there seemed to be very little attention being paid to it. And you could almost see, like clockwork, every year it would go up by about 1.5 to 2 parts per million. And back then, 25 years ago, I kind of thought, well, this is probably going to be a problem which economics would solve by itself. The price of oil was going up, and there seemed to be, at that time, peak oil seemed to be a real theory and something which people, a lot of economics professionals thought was going to be what was going to save us from fossil fuel production and, and move us into alternative energies. But then, the fracking boom happened in the US, alternative oil, shale oils happened in Canada, and suddenly the economics of oil production changed dramatically. And for me, that was kind of a bit of a turning point, thinking, okay, this isn't going to solve itself. We need to be actively talking about solutions, actively thinking about them more, and creating a case for why we need to move away now, rather than wait until things run out, which may not be for another 50 years, at which time temperatures would have risen a lot higher than they are now. And a lot of the world's population, especially poorer people, will suffer a lot more as a consequence of that.
Yeah, that was a big concern for me as well. I read a book in 2006 called Peak Oil, and then moved back to Scotland from the Netherlands and got involved in the transition time movement because of my fears about that. But yeah, and then thereafter.
Well, thereafter, sort of, I suppose in the last 5-6 years, I've become sort of more concerned and a bit more active around climate change. So around 5-6 years ago, I started actively posting on Twitter, just sharing stories around climate change, stories I've read and sort of resonated with me personally, and sharing a little bit of comments around them as well. And I started building up a bit of a following. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I can use my voice to do a bit more. And I kind of thought, actually, a lot of the news stories we read are about, more around doom and gloom, around actually, climate change is a huge problem. We're not doing enough to solve it. These are the consequences, but not talking so much about the solutions to climate change. And we have an awful lot of solutions out there. The problem is more one of political and economic problem to be able to implement those solutions, rather than those solutions not existing.
Well, that's where we are now with the last report from the IPCC, and with the sixth report from the IPCC, which says that all of the solutions and all of the finance and everything's there. It's just lacking the political will to do it. So yeah, so we're in a very different position from Karen, you reading that book in 2006, and Paul, when you started your journey. I wanted to just kind of find out a little bit more about the book club. And let's get into it. Could you recommend 3 good climate economic books?
Yeah, sure. So I've got 3 very different books here. The first book is Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel. It's an excellent book for understanding a lot of the history behind sort of capitalism and where we are now. It takes you back through an economic journey, which is very interesting, and also explains, some of the false assumptions or some of the incorrect data we've used to make decisions on. So, for example, one key piece of data in that book is around actually, the number of poor people in the world and level of poverty in the world, and how actually capitalism has transformed that. But there's some key errors in how that data is put together. the data from recent years is used as household surveys, which is very accurate, but you go back beyond a certain area, so back 200 years, and it uses a different set of data and a different set of assumptions, and then assumes that all the data is equal. And it doesn't really line up very well. The second book is Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, by Catherine Hayhoe. Catherine's a climate professor in Texas, and the book is talks a lot around the importance of communicating climate change, talking about climate change. One of the key things around talking about climate change is, we talk about what we care about, and the more we talk about it, the more we're able to influence other people. And one of Catherine's key ideas is around, actually, we shouldn't focus so much on carbon footprint, but we should think more about our carbon shadow. And our carbon shadow is the areas where we have influence over. So, if you work for a company, you can speak to your leaders of that company around climate change and ask them what they are doing about climate change for their company. You can, talk to your local council. You can run for local council. You can speak to your friends and family. Everybody has people who they have some influence over, and we can by talking about climate change, we can shift the dial a bit and make people vote more on climate change and make it a part of their day-to-day decision making.
I do a lot of consulting in the events industry, but I've been persuading event organisers to be much more sustainable and to consider these things, because they're not doing it at an individual level. I would quite often organise a dinner for 1,000 people. So if we provide a vegetarian main rather than a meat main, that's 3 years of one individual's consumption of meat. So there is so much that you can do when you kind of state that. But I really like that. I like that carbon shadow. I think that's really, really good. And the third book?
The third book is a little bit different. I've just read it, and it's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kilmer. And what struck me about this book in particular was, I think it's the first book where it's really changed the way I think about climate change. So early on in the book, Robin asks a class of her ecology students, who are undergraduate students studying ecology, can you name a place or time or an instance where humans are positively benefiting the environment, not just building wind turbines or something, but actually enhancing the environment around them as well. So living in balance with it, but actually improving it. And none of her students could name anything, and neither could I until I read further on. but actually, it made me think about, actually, we're so separated from nature as humans. We completely live next to it rather than with it. And I think actually changing our mindset around this and thinking about, actually, how can we incorporate our solutions into nature more so that they enhance nature and not solving the human problems. And I think actually that would probably produce solutions which are better overall for the planet and for people.
Yeah, Jason Hickel alludes to that concept of dualism that came from Descartes in Less is More, and that this way that we have existed and seen nature as something to be plundered rather than something to a lot of indigenous populations see it as a family member, and that we are the stewards, and we've really got to be cognizant of that.
Absolutely, I fully subscribe to that, actually. And it's I like the 7 generations way of thinking about things as well. Think about, are we improving the world for the 7th generation, not just the next generation or our generation, and thinking really, truly long term.
When we're looking at the kind of economics of the climate crisis, a lot of people focus on the ways to reduce carbon use. And I thought it'd be really interesting, because I followed one of your fascinating threads on Twitter, was about this idea of a personal carbon budget. Would you like to kind of go through that for us and explain what that would look like and what impact it would have?
This is an idea which has been talked about quite a lot over the past few years. And basically, the way it would work would be, you would set a budget for all of the households in the country. And then you would divide that budget up amongst the people equally. So at the moment, I think the average emission per person in the UK is around 9 tons per person of carbon per year, but it's not evenly used up. So at the moment, I think the top 10% of emitters in the UK, if you like, emit as much carbon as the bottom 40%. So if you were to set the level at just above the average to start with, you would then give everybody an allowance of, say, 10 tons of carbon per year. You would find the people who have high emission lifestyles, so people who fly a lot, have huge cars, maybe very big houses, they would quickly use up their budget, and they would have to buy more from people who are using their budget much slower, which would tend to be poorer people, generally speaking. So one of the benefits is you'd also have a transfer of wealth from richer people to poorer people, at the same time providing an incentive for richer people who have both the options to be able to reduce their emissions more, both through improving the decisions they have around their lifestyle. They could choose to fly less, or they could choose, in extreme cases, not to go by private plane. They could choose to insulate their house more. They could choose to buy an electric car rather than have a petrol or diesel car. But also they have the options to be able to not do things as well, which people on lower incomes don't always have the choices to do. So it would drive the emissions down from the largest polluters in the UK, individuals, and at the same time give more income to lower income people. But one of the keys to the carbon budgets, though, is that each year you would reduce it slightly. So year 1 is 10 tons, year 2 is, say, 9.5 tons, year 3 9 tons. And so what you're actually doing is you're reducing the overall carbon emissions from UK households. And actually, this is something we don't really grapple with very well in many countries. We look at reducing emissions over individual things, but we don't look at the whole. So, we're looking at reducing emissions from transport by electrifying the road system, for example. We're banning petrol and diesel cars from 2030 or 2032. I can't remember now. But so that's going to massively reduce emissions from transport, but we're not doing anything with planes. People might just be flying more, and actually air travel is forecast to rise over the next 10 years.
This would be, a properly kind of regulated and official process where everyone would, through an app or something like that, I would imagine would get their carbon amount and would then trade that with people who are in the market. So that's similar to the cap and trade that currently certain businesses, high polluting businesses, do in the UK and across Europe. Is it the same kind of principle?
Essentially, it's a very, very similar principle. It's just on an individual level rather than at a company level. That is essentially the main difference. I mean, there are some logistical challenges with the personal carbon budget. For example, what do you include within that? Some things would be very easy to include, say, household energy and transport, for example, because that's already, added up automatically pretty much. But other things would be more complicated. For example, the food we eat, you'd need some sort of mechanism for being able to track that carbon spend as well. But I would recommend, you start simple. You start with the easy stuff. You do the transport, you do household, and you move on from there.
And it's an approximation, isn't it? It's roughly roundabout. And if you fly to Mallorca with your family once a year, then you've got let's say 6 tons of carbon. But if you're flying every week to Geneva, then that you're going to have 600 tons just from that. So it's a rough approximation. You're going to be in a situation where you can know to pretty closely how much carbon that you're using. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, is there anyone else talking about this?
But there's been quite a lot of attention in the press. It comes up now and again, but there's been a few small voluntary sort of trials, but there hasn't been anything sort of official done yet, which is a shame. I think sort of someone needs to sort of take it forward, even if it's a sort of local level. I mean, there are other advantages to this as well, in that, by focusing on the emissions from the highest polluters, there are also the people who are decision makers often, and the people with most influence to be able to, go to the people they're buying their services from and demand lower carbon services. So, I mean, if you take air transport, as you mentioned, there's a big difference between traveling economy versus traveling first class versus traveling in a private jet. I think a first class traveler uses something like 8 times as much or something as an economy traveler, because they're taking up more space in the aircraft. And so, you could drive changes as well at sort of this more industrial corporate level as well. I mean, if electric planes were to be rolled out faster for short haul transport, that would make a big difference in those carbon emissions as well.
Yeah, I think with this, we need for things like this to work. It's about having a substitute, isn't it? Because otherwise, it can be seen as a real kind of punishment. But for example, let's say having a burger, as a kind of play, if there's too much carbon in your burger, if you want to have that same burger experience, you have a kind of vegan or plant-based burger. But it is about having that substitute, isn't it? And I think we're in the situation now where we can look right across society and all the things that we do and all the things that we have, and there is a greener alternative for almost all of this. So there is an alternative for people to move who do feel or who have to reduce their carbon. And as you've said, but also the other option is a redistributive, and that they can buy carbon credits from people who are not using it. So I think that's fascinating. Do you know how that's different from a kind of more traditional carbon tax?
So a carbon tax is really the other way around almost. So basically, the government will come in and say, okay, we're going to put a price on carbon. We're going to tax these items, and then it'll pass those taxes on to the company, who will pass the money back to the government. I mean, ultimately, it gets passed on to the end consumer, but there's no trading element on that. And the government then decides what it's going to do with that extra money. It's going to reduce other taxes, give it back in a dividend, or spend it on something else, and that would then be a normal democratic choice through governments. There's something which is coming in with restaurants soon, where they're going to have to start showing the number of calories on a meal. And you can then see, okay, do I want this 2,000 calorie ice cream extravaganza, or do I want to go for this 300 calorie more modest thing? And you appreciate the personal trade-offs from that. Maybe the 300 calorie thing's not so tasty, but it's a lot easier to work off. But if you do the same thing with carbon as well, put the carbon intensity of the different foods on the menu, people then have the information to be able to make the choice. You're not forcing anyone.
Yeah, without forcing. I think that would be fantastic. I know that there's a rough approximation that the more calorific a meal, the more carbon that's likely to have been used in producing that meal, because meat tends to be more calorific than vegetables and protein. So it's like a rough approximation. So it's not too bad. And I think there will be a lot of research to see what impact this has had. And I think it'll be substantial, because some restaurants have been doing this for years. I can't remember. There's one particular chain in the UK that's done this for at least 10 years. And it definitely has. It's that kind of ceteris paribus. If all things are equal, you're going to go, well, the ones with less calories, and that can make a really big difference. So that's really interesting. So we're heading towards some kind of solutions now. Do you want to give us an idea of some of the other solutions that you think, let's say, would be relatively easy to introduce, that would make a substantial benefit towards reducing individuals, countries, or organizations' carbon?
Sure. So I mean, a lot of the solutions which get a lot of attention are the more glitzy technological ones, but actually insulating your house is a very low tech solution, but can have a massive implications across the UK. The UK has got a particularly old housing stock. A lot of our houses have been built in the Victorian times. A lot of these houses have been subdivided into flats, and not always particularly well. A lot of them are quite drafty, and spending money insulating those homes would have a number of other benefits as well. I mean, you're lowering emissions permanently. It's relatively low cost compared to other solutions. You're also lowering the energy costs for millions of people, and particularly lower income people. At the moment when energy prices are sky high, this is a perfect time to be really investing in insulation. I mean, another area which is really quite fascinating is heat pumps as well. Again, not very glamorous, but considerably more efficient than traditional gas central heating, which most of the UK is heated by. And there's some quite high startup costs for initial costs for heat pumps, but once they start getting rolled out on a mass scale, they're going to come down dramatically. And I think heat pumps, insulation are the two biggest things I would vote for reducing the UK's emissions.
And I've read that probably solar panels are maybe a better option because, of course, you need energy to run the heat pumps as well. So I would probably say insulation first, and then maybe look at solar panels before heat pumps.
The best way to reduce energy consumption is to insulate homes, and as you said, all the benefits. Yeah. There's no downside to this, and it's incredible that even now in the UK's energy strategy that was released just last month, there was nothing about insulation. Or very little.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is there's no profit motive, really. It means that the big energy companies, they want to sell energy, and if we keep reducing the amount of energy that we require, then that's a problem for them, because we're living in a capitalist world, so we've got to move away from that. But I was going to come back to the carbon credits. So this is an idea that I've come across maybe about a year ago. Steve Keen, another economist that we've had on the show, he talked about it in one of his podcasts. And I think it's a really great idea. I think one of the criticisms I saw on your Twitter page was, perhaps you would maybe end up with people scooping up loads of poor people's carbon credits, but I don't really know what the disadvantage of that is, because if they're getting money, then that's probably maybe a good thing. And if it's, as long as they're not like the Russian shares for Gazprom, where they're just issued once, if they're issued every year, then that should eradicate that cost. And then going on from what you were talking about from the third book, from your carbon shadow, well, Steve went on to put himself forward as a candidate for the new Liberal Party in Australia as well. And I just want to give a shout out during this program as well that this morning I've just heard that in the Highlands there's only 8 women standing for the council elections. There is something like 30 odd candidates. So, really, ladies watching the show, if anyone's telling you to stand and you think you should stand, you should probably stand. So, and use your carbon shadow and get into places where they have a budget and you can affect how that budget is spent.
So obviously we're speaking about the climate crisis. What role do you think economists and economic theory has in changing our approach to the climate crisis?
I think it's sort of a massive effect. I mean, I think actually we need to sort of realize that actually economics drives a lot of our decisions in our lives, whether we like it or not. And I think there's some things which can be done at sort of very large scale, around sort of cap and trade or personal carbon budgets, but there's also sort of much smaller scale which can have a big effect as well, like sort of nudge economics and sort of nudging people into making the right choices. And there's been a lot of research around this showing that actually, the way you order people's choices can make a huge difference in the decisions they make. So I mean, at a business level, you could say in a restaurant, for example, you could put the low carbon choices at the top of the menu rather than at the bottom of the menu. You could include more vegetarian options as well as the meat options. So you're not forcing anybody to do anything, but actually you're going to make a huge difference in your organization's carbon footprint doing this. And this could be sort of followed through all the way through as well, through huge areas, so into shops, for example, supermarkets, where you place different products would make a big difference. And you're not taking away anyone's choices, you're just changing the default option for people.
I was working in the, in the events industry, I was speaking to a lot of the hotels, and I was saying to them, people are really influenced by what they think other people are doing. And for example, if you put something in your hotel room that says 2/3 of our guests use the same towel for more than one day, that measurably has a significant impact on the activities of the other people entering. And I remember reading about this. I actually saw a presentation. It was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I'm thinking, this is just fantastic. And I started telling my clients, now I go into hotel rooms, it's still exactly the same. There's very few instances of nudging going on to change people's behavior. And I just find that, I suppose, fascinating in the sense, because if you're a hotel, you don't want to wash as many. It's much cheaper for you to wash less. So there's these incentives. And I think that's kind of where I wanted to finish, Paul, is that how do we go over this? That there's really clear incentives. There's a logical process to a lot of the solutions we've covered in this. But why aren't things happening? Why do we seem to be stuck in this position where, certainly from my perspective, we're not moving at anywhere near a fast enough pace that we need to really start to talk about getting to net zero emissions, and then start thinking about drawing down the carbon that's in the atmosphere already?
I mean, I always fall back onto, what are the incentive systems for people to do different things? Is it in the case you just sort of described around hotels? It appears to be in everyone's interests to use fewer towels, pretty much. But by just changing a label, the hotels could, save a lot of money on laundry. Probably the towels will probably last longer as well, save money on detergent, etc. But they're not doing it for some reason. So I wonder if the person responsible for making that decision gets any benefit for making that decision. What are their incentives? If you had some sort of maybe profit sharing sort of solution within those environments, where sort of all the staff are encouraged to come up with solutions to save money and to save carbon, and they get to keep a share of those savings as well. Perhaps that would drive some of those changes through faster.
It's been fascinating spending a little bit of time with you, Paul. Before you go, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your book club, because I've just joined it, and I'm looking forward to the first recommendation. Do you want to tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit about it?
So I started this book club at the end of last year. It started by I sent out a tweet saying, does anybody want to read one book on climate change a month, and then meet up over Zoom to discuss it. I was hoping to find, sort of 5 or 6 people around the world to have spend an hour a month with discussing a book. Thought it'd be quite fascinating. I sent it last thing in the evening. I woke up the next morning and saw there was like over 100 replies to it. So I thought, I need to set up something a little bit more formal to this. So I set up a newsletter on Review, which is Twitter's newsletter platform, and it's free to join. And once a month, the members nominate books. I pick 5 at random, and then we vote on those 5 in the book club. And then once a month, on the 3rd Thursday of every month at 7:30 UK time, we meet up and we discuss the book.
Fascinating. I noticed you've got over 700 people subscribed to that book club. So even if you're getting, just 50 people attending, there's probably 700 people reading these climate books, which is proving that you're having a good carbon shadow, Paul. So it's good. It's good that you're putting into action some of the things that you're saying. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's been fascinating hearing your thoughts on climate solutions.
Yeah.